Have you ever wondered what secrets could be hidden in the most innocent of objects? What dark truths might be concealed in plain sight, waiting for someone brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to uncover them? Before you continue watching this video, I need to ask you, are you prepared to hear about one of the most disturbing cases that has remained largely unknown to the public for over a century? If you're watching this video, take a moment to comment where you're from. We need your support to continue bringing these hidden stories to light. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Your subscription helps us uncover and share these forgotten horrors that some would prefer remained buried. In the autumn of 1905, the small mining community of Blackwell Hollow, West Virginia, was shaken to its core when local authorities discovered the remains of 7 individuals buried in a remote clearing in the Appalachian foothills. The bodies, in various states of decomposition, suggested the killings had occurred over a period of approximately 3 years. What made this case particularly unusual was not just the methodical nature of the killings, but the complete absence of any leads. That is, until a peculiar item was discovered that would ultimately reveal the identity of the killer. The case began on October 12, 1905, when Luther Haynes, a local trapper, was tracking a wounded fox through the dense woodland, approximately 4 miles northeast of Blackwell Hollow. As he followed the blood trail into a small clearing, Haynes noticed what appeared to be a recently disturbed patch of earth. Initially believing it might be the den of the wounded animal, he began to dig, only to uncover a human hand. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Thomas Blackwood on October 13th, upon arrival at the scene, indicated by Mr. Haynes at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, I observed what appeared to be a grave site. Further excavation revealed the remains of an adult male, estimated to be between 20 and 30 years of age. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, suggesting it had been buried for several months. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be similar disturbances in the earth nearby. By the end of that week, Sheriff Blackwood, with assistance from neighboring Berkeley County, had exhumed a total of 7 bodies from the clearing. The victims, 4 men and 3 women, showed no immediate signs of how they had been killed. There were no gunshot wounds, no obvious trauma, and no ligature marks. Medical examiner Dr. Frederick Collins would later determine that all 7 victims had died from asphyxiation, though the specific method remained unclear. The victims were eventually identified as transients or travelers passing through the area. None were local to Blackwell Hollow, which perhaps explained why their disappearances had gone largely unnoticed. They included a traveling salesman from Ohio, a young woman believed to be on her way to visit relatives in Richmond, and a married couple who had been reported missing after failing to arrive at their daughter's home in Charleston. The investigation quickly stalled. With no witnesses and no clear motive, Sheriff Blackwood and his deputies had little to go on. The isolated location of the graves suggested the killer was familiar with the area, but that described nearly everyone in the small community. Without physical evidence connecting anyone to the crimes, the case might have gone unsolved indefinitely. 3 weeks into the investigation, on November 2nd, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 12-year-old Samuel Jenkins was playing in the woods approximately a quarter-mile from the grave site when he discovered a small wooden box buried beneath a fallen oak tree. Inside the box was a ledger, unlike any that had been seen in those parts before. Samuel's mother, Esther Jenkins, provided the following statement. "My boy came running home that afternoon, clutching this strange book to his chest. Said he found it in the hollow of an old tree that had fallen in last month's storm. At first, I thought it was just an old account book, but when I opened it, I knew something wasn't right. The pages weren't paper. They were made of beeswax, thin sheets of it with writing pressed into them. I couldn't make heads or tails of the writing, but there were drawings too. drawings that no God-fearing person should ever have to see. The ledger was immediately turned over to Sheriff Blackwood, who described it as follows in his supplementary report. The item in question appears to be a handmade book consisting of 27 pages of pressed beeswax, approximately 8 inches by 6 inches in dimension. The wax has been treated in some manner to make it firm yet pliable. Inscribed on these pages are writings in what appears to be a personalized cipher or code, along with detailed anatomical drawings of the human body, focusing primarily on the respiratory system. Of particular note are 7 pages that contain what appear to be dates, followed by brief entries and small locks of hair pressed into the wax. The ledger was sent to Professor Harold Montgomery at West Virginia University, who specialized in cryptography and had assisted law enforcement in previous cases. On November 20th, Professor Montgomery sent a telegram to Sheriff Blackwood that would change the course of the investigation. Have deciphered portions of wax ledger. Stop appears to be detailed account of murders. Stop author documents. Method suffocation using specialized apparatus. Stop. Last page contains name Elias Whitaker. Stop. Suggesting immediate action. Stop. Will arrive with full translation tomorrow. Stop. Elias Whitaker was a name known to many in Blackwell Hollow, though few could claim to know the man himself. It took Montgomery nearly 2 weeks to decipher the text, a task made more difficult by the fact that the author had created a unique substitution cipher that incorporated elements of Latin, Greek, and what appeared to be personal symbols. At 47 years of age, Whitaker was a reclusive beekeeper who lived in a small cabin approximately 3 miles from where the bodies had been discovered. He was known to sell honey and beeswax candles at the local market once a month, but otherwise kept to himself. He was widowed, his wife having died of tuberculosis some 5 years prior, and had no children. Sheriff Blackwood, Deputy James Wilson, and 3 armed volunteers arrived at Whitaker's cabin in the early hours of November 21st. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The cabin, from outward appearances a simple if somewhat neglected dwelling, contained a hidden cellar accessed through a trapdoor beneath a rug in the main room. In this underground chamber, illuminated by beeswax candles, they discovered what could only be described as a workshop of horrors. Deputy Wilson's official statement, recorded on November 22nd, provides a disturbing glimpse into what was found. The cellar was approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, with walls lined with shelves. Upon these shelves were dozens of glass jars containing what appeared to be human organs, preserved in some kind of fluid. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, with leather restraints at each corner. Beside this table was a smaller workbench, where we discovered an apparatus consisting of a bellows connected to a mask, which we believe was used to control the breathing of the victims. Most disturbing of all were the additional ledgers, 9 in total, each similar to the one discovered by the Jenkins boy. These contained detailed accounts of not just the 7 victims we had discovered, but 15 others whose remains have yet to be located. The entries dated back nearly 12 years. Whitaker himself was not present when the authorities arrived. A search of the surrounding area yielded no immediate sign of the man, though his horse was still in its stable, suggesting he had fled on foot. The discovery at Whitaker's cabin sent shockwaves through the community of Blackwell Hollow. How could such atrocities have been committed in their midst without anyone suspecting? The answer, it seemed, lay partly in Whitaker's carefully cultivated persona of the harmless, grieving widower, and partly in the nature of the community itself, isolated, with residents who valued privacy and minded their own business. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Elias Whitaker. He had not always been a beekeeper. Before moving to West Virginia, he had studied medicine at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, though he never completed his degree. According to university records, Whitaker had been asked to leave the program in 1882 after several disturbing incidents involving unauthorized experimentation. Dr. William Osler, who had been a professor at Johns Hopkins during Whitaker's time there, provided the following statement via letter. "I recall Mr. Whitaker quite clearly, despite the passage of many years. He was brilliant, perhaps one of the most naturally gifted students I have encountered, but there was always something unsettling about his approach to medicine. He was obsessed with the mechanics of respiration, with controlling and extending the moment between life and death. His final experiment, which resulted in his expulsion, involved attempting to revive a deceased patient using a bellows apparatus of his own design. When discovered, he was not attempting resuscitation, as one might charitably assume, but rather seemed to be studying the body's response to controlled airflow after death. It was most disturbing. Following his expulsion from medical school, Whitaker's whereabouts were unknown for several years. He resurfaced in Blackwell Hollow in 1893, purchasing a small plot of land with what he claimed was an inheritance from his late father. He established his beekeeping operation shortly thereafter and married local woman Catherine Mills in 1896. According to all accounts, their marriage appeared normal, if somewhat private. Catherine's death in 1900 was officially attributed to tuberculosis, though given what was now known about Whitaker, authorities began to question this diagnosis. Unfortunately, her body had been cremated at Whitaker's insistence, making it impossible to determine if she had, in fact, been his first victim. The search for Elias Whitaker continued throughout the winter of 1905 and into the spring of 1906, but despite the efforts of law enforcement across 3 states, no trace of him was found. It was as if he had simply vanished into the Appalachian wilderness. The case might have remained in this unresolved state had it not been for an unusual discovery made in April 1906. A surveyor working for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was marking a potential route through a remote section of forest approximately 20 miles from Blackwell Hollow when he came across a small cave entrance partially hidden by vegetation. Inside the cave, the surveyor, Robert Campbell, discovered what appeared to be a temporary camp, long abandoned. Among the items left behind was a leather satchel containing personal effects that would later be identified as belonging to Elias Whitaker. Most significant, however, was another beeswax ledger, the most disturbing of all those discovered. In his official report dated April 17, 1906, Sheriff Blackwood described the contents of this final ledger. The document appears to be Whitaker's manifesto, explaining in horrific detail both his methodology and his twisted philosophy. He writes of his belief that the human soul escapes through the final breath, and that by controlling this process, by extending it through his apparatus, he could capture what he termed the essence of human transition. Most alarmingly, the ledger contains detailed maps of locations across West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, with markings that we believe indicate the burial sites of his additional victims. The final entry, dated November 20th, 1905, the very day Professor Montgomery deciphered the first ledger, indicates Whitaker's awareness that his work in Blackwell Hollow had been discovered. The entry concludes with the disturbing statement, "I go now to continue my great work elsewhere. What I have learned cannot be unlearned, and what I have begun cannot be ended." Over the next year, authorities would locate an additional 11 grave sites based on the maps in Whitaker's ledger, bringing his confirmed victim count to 26. However, the man himself remained elusive, with reported sightings across the eastern United States leading nowhere. In December 1906, the case took another unexpected turn when a package arrived at the office of the Berkeley County Register, the newspaper that had most extensively covered the Whitaker case. Inside was a small box made of polished beechwood containing a single sheet of beeswax. Pressed into the wax was a message written in Whitaker's distinctive cipher, which Professor Montgomery translated as follows: "You have my ledgers, but not my knowledge. You have found my victims, but not understood my purpose. I continue my work now with greater caution among those who would never suspect. Look for me in the places where the sick and dying gather, for there I walk as one of many, harvesting the final breaths that others wastefully allow to dissipate. This is my last communication. The next ledger will only be found when I, too, have crossed the threshold between life and death. This message was the last confirmed communication from Elias Whittaker. Despite a renewed investigation and alerts sent to hospitals and medical facilities across the country, he was never apprehended. As the years passed, the case gradually faded from public consciousness, becoming little more than a local legend in the hills of West Virginia. However, the story does not end there. In 1915, a physician named Edward Green was arrested in Cincinnati, Ohio, after a nurse discovered him performing an unauthorized procedure on a recently deceased patient. In Green's home, authorities found an apparatus similar to the one described in Whittaker's ledgers, along with detailed notes on the collection of terminal breath. While Green initially maintained his innocence, claiming his research was purely scientific, a search of his background revealed discrepancies in his credentials and personal history. Before his case could go to trial, however, Green managed to escape from custody. He was found 3 days later in his cell at the Hamilton County Jail, having apparently taken his own life by means of asphyxiation. No definitive connection between Green and Whittaker was ever established, though the similarities in their methods and interests led many to speculate that they were, in fact, the same person. The matter might have remained purely speculative had it not been for a small detail mentioned in the coroner's report. Green's body bore a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder blade, described as roughly in the shape of a honeycomb. No such marking had ever been mentioned in descriptions of Elias Whittaker, but then again, few had ever seen the reclusive beekeeper without his customary layers of clothing. In the decades that followed, similar cases would occasionally emerge. A hospital orderly in Philadelphia in 1927, a mortician's assistant in Baltimore in 1934, a nursing home attendant in Richmond in 1942. Each involving the manipulation of the deceased or dying, each suspect described as a solitary man of advancing years, each disappearing before the full extent of their activities could be determined. In several cases, small objects made of beeswax were found among their possessions. Were these men all Elias Whittaker, somehow extending his life far beyond what should have been possible? Or were they disciples, individuals who had somehow encountered Whittaker's philosophy and continued his work? The truth may never be known with certainty. What is known is that the last confirmed sighting of someone matching Whittaker's description and methodology occurred in 1952, nearly 50 years after the discovery of the Blackwell Hollow graves. If this was indeed Whittaker, he would have been in his 90s, an implausible though not impossible age. The original beeswax ledgers, along with the apparatus discovered in Whittaker's cellar, were kept as evidence in the Berkeley County Courthouse until 1964, when a fire destroyed much of the building and its contents. All that remains of these items today are the detailed descriptions in the official reports and a few photographs taken by Professor Montgomery, now housed in the West Virginia State Archives. The clearing where the original 7 victims were discovered has long since been reclaimed by the forest. Blackwell Hollow itself no longer exists as a distinct community, having been gradually abandoned as the local mining operations closed in the 1950s. The site of Whittaker's cabin is now part of a state forest, with no visible trace remaining of the horrors that once took place there. Yet for those who know the story, there remains an unease about certain remote areas of the Appalachian forests. Local hikers occasionally report finding small objects made of beeswax hanging from tree branches. Tiny, intricate representations of human lungs or masks that would fit no human face. Park rangers dismiss these as hoaxes perpetrated by those familiar with the legend, but some wonder if there might be more to these discoveries. In 2003, a spelunker exploring an unmapped cave system in southern Pennsylvania made a disturbing discovery. A small chamber containing what appeared to be the remains of a makeshift laboratory. Among the rusted equipment and decayed furniture was a collection of glass jars, their contents long since deteriorated, and what the spelunker described as thin, yellowish sheets stacked on a stone shelf. By the time authorities reached the remote location, however, a flash flood had washed through the cave system, destroying or carrying away whatever might have been there. The spelunker, Martin Reeves, would later state in an interview with a local newspaper, "I've been exploring caves for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't just some kid's hangout or a moonshiner's stash. Someone had been living down there maybe a long time ago. The strangest thing was this smell, like honey, but with something else underneath, something that made the hairs on your neck stand up. And there were these markings on the wall, not graffiti, but careful drawings. They looked like lungs, human lungs, connected to some kind of machine. I took photos, but none of them came out, just black frames. When I went back with the police, it was all gone. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember that smell. I still catch it sometimes when the wind blows just right." Reeves's experience is just one of many strange occurrences that continue to be associated with the legacy of Elias Whitaker and his beeswax ledgers. While science and rational inquiry would suggest that Whitaker died decades ago, his true fate remains unknown. The possibility that he passed his knowledge to others, creating a lineage of those obsessed with capturing the essence of human transition, cannot be entirely dismissed. Even today, in certain rural hospitals and hospice facilities throughout the Appalachian region, nurses sometimes speak in hushed tones about elderly patients who take too keen an interest in the dying, or of unfamiliar doctors who appear during night shifts and cannot be located the following day. Most dismiss these as nothing more than urban legends, the kind of stories that naturally evolve in places where life and death exist in such close proximity. But in a small museum of local history in what was once Berkeley County, there is a photograph taken in 1905. It shows Sheriff Thomas Blackwood standing outside the courthouse, holding what appears to be one of the beeswax ledgers. In the background, partially obscured by shadow, is a figure that the museum catalogue identifies simply as unidentified bystander. The figure's face is not clearly visible, but in his hand appears to be a small object, possibly a jar or container, with something that catches the light in a way that suggests the golden hue of beeswax. Visitors to the museum occasionally comment on the strange expression just barely discernible on the face of this unidentified bystander. Some describe it as a smile of satisfaction, others as a look of quiet anticipation. The museum curator typically dismisses such observations, pointing out that the photographic techniques of the time required long exposures, often resulting in blurred or distorted features. Yet the questions persist. Did Elias Whitaker truly disappear into the wilderness that November night in 1905? Or did he perhaps remain much closer than anyone suspected, observing the investigation into his crimes with the same methodical interest with which he had studied his victims? And what of the beeswax ledgers themselves? Could objects so meticulously crafted, so deeply imbued with their creator's twisted purpose, truly be destroyed in a simple courthouse fire? Or might they, like the knowledge they contained, have found their way into new hands, continuing to spread their influence across generations? In the end, the case of the Blackwell Hollow murders and the beeswax ledger that named the killer remains officially closed. Elias Whitaker, if he is indeed long dead, was never brought to justice for his crimes. The full extent of his activities and whether they continued beyond 1905 may never be known with certainty. But for those who have studied the case, there remains a lingering suspicion that the final chapter has yet to be written. The search for answers continues, driven by the same human curiosity that has always sought to understand the darkest corners of our nature. A curiosity that Elias Whittaker himself might have recognized and appreciated. And somewhere, perhaps, in a quiet room filled with the sweet scent of honey and beeswax, another ledger is being carefully prepared, its pages waiting to receive the pressed impressions of unspeakable knowledge. For those who have followed the dark journey of Elias Whittaker thus far, you might wonder if such evil could truly vanish without a trace. The year is now 1933, nearly 3 decades after the discovery of the Blackwell Hollow graves, and a young journalist named Catherine Merritt has become obsessed with uncovering the truth behind one of America's least known but most disturbing serial killers. Catherine, a graduate of Columbia University's School of Journalism, had first encountered the Whittaker case while researching a series of articles on unsolved crimes for the Pittsburgh Gazette. What began as professional curiosity quickly evolved into something more consuming. The more she learned about the Beeswax ledgers and their creator, the more convinced she became that the story was far from over. In her personal journal, dated March 12, 1933, Catherine wrote, "I dreamt of the ledgers again last night. In my dream, I could feel the texture of the wax beneath my fingertips, could trace the indentations of Whittaker's cipher. The pages seemed to warm under my touch, as if they contained not just information, but something alive. I woke with the scent of honey in my nostrils, so strong I was convinced someone had been in my room. This case is beginning to affect me in ways I hadn't anticipated, yet I cannot abandon it now. There is something here, something that wants to be found." Catherine's investigation began with a review of all available public records related to the case, but she quickly discovered that much of the original documentation had been lost in the courthouse fire. Undeterred, she sought out individuals who might have personal knowledge of the events. Family members of the victims, descendants of those involved in the investigation, anyone who might shed new light on the decades-old mystery. It was during this phase of her research that Catherine first encountered Howard Blackwood, grandson of Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, who had led the original investigation. Howard, then in his late 40s, had inherited his grandfather's personal effects, including a journal that had not been included in the official record. In an interview conducted on April 5, 1933, Howard shared the following. "My grandfather never spoke much about the Whittaker case while he was alive. It was only after his death in 1920 that we found the journal in a locked drawer of his desk. The entries concerning the case reveal a man deeply troubled by what he had discovered. He writes of nightmares, of waking in the middle of the night convinced that Whittaker was standing at the foot of his bed. Most disturbing are his final entries, written just days before his death from what was officially recorded as heart failure. He claimed to have seen Whittaker on the street in Martinsburg, not as the man would have appeared in 1920, in his 60s, but unchanged from 1905, as if time had no hold on him." Howard provided Catherine with access to his grandfather's journal, which contained information never made public. Among the most significant revelations was Sheriff Blackwood's suspicion that Whittaker had not acted alone. Several entries referenced a second set of footprints found near some of the grave sites, smaller than Whittaker's, and with a distinctive pattern suggesting a partial clubfoot or other deformity. More troubling still was Blackwood's account of an interview with a patient at the Western State Hospital for the Insane in Staunton, Virginia. The patient, identified only as J.M., claimed to have been Whittaker's apprentice for a brief period in 1899, before fleeing in terror upon discovering the true nature of his mentor's research. According to J.M., Whittaker had spoken of others who shared his interests, a loose network of individuals scattered across the country who communicated through coded messages published in medical journals and newspapers. Catherine's next step was to locate any surviving copies of the photographs taken by Professor Montgomery of the Beeswax ledgers. After weeks of inquiries, she discovered that while the West Virginia State Archives held the official photographs, Montgomery's personal collection had been donated to the library at West Virginia University following his death in 1922. It was among these personal effects that Catherine found something extraordinary, a small wooden box containing what appeared to be rubbings taken from one of the original ledgers. Montgomery had pressed paper against the wax pages and carefully traced the indentations, creating a record of Whitaker's writings that had survived the courthouse fire. The university librarian, Margaret Wilson, recounted her impressions upon showing these items to Catherine. "I've worked with rare manuscripts for over 15 years, but I've never seen anyone react to a document the way Miss Merritt did when she opened that box. The color drained from her face, and for a moment I thought she might faint. When I asked if she was all right, she said something I found rather odd. She said, 'It's warm. Can you feel it? The paper is warm.' I touched one of the sheets myself and felt nothing unusual, just old paper, slightly yellowed with age. But she insisted, and there was a look in her eyes that made me uneasy. I suggested we break for lunch, and when we returned, she seemed more composed, though she handled the documents with a strange mixture of reverence and fear. The rubbings provided Catherine with insights into Whitaker's methodology that had not been included in the official reports. His cipher, once translated, revealed not just a record of murders, but a pseudo-scientific philosophy that combined elements of vitalism, ancient Egyptian beliefs about the Ba, soul, and his own distorted interpretation of emerging theories about cellular respiration. Whitaker believed that the final breath contained what he called the quintessence of consciousness, and that by capturing and somehow preserving this essence, he could eventually achieve a form of immortality. His ledgers detailed increasingly elaborate attempts to extract, contain, and ultimately consume this essence, with the beeswax serving not just as a recording medium, but as a storage vessel of sorts. Armed with this new information, Catherine expanded her investigation, searching for patterns in unsolved murders or suspicious deaths across the eastern United States in the decades following Whitaker's disappearance. She compiled a list of cases that matched his methodology or contained elements suggesting his influence. Bodies found without obvious cause of death, later determined to be asphyxiation. Incidents occurring near apiaries or involving individuals connected to beekeeping. Reports of small objects made of beeswax found at or near crime scenes. Her research led her to a small town in rural Pennsylvania, where in 1912, 3 transients had been found dead in an abandoned barn. The local coroner had been unable to determine cause of death, though he noted that all 3 victims showed unusual discoloration around the mouth and nostrils. A beekeeper's mask had been found nearby, but was not definitively connected to the deaths. Catherine traveled to the town in June 1933, hoping to examine any records that might still exist. The local newspaper had gone out of business years earlier, but she managed to locate the former editor, now elderly, and living in a small cottage on the outskirts of town. The editor, Franklin Pierce, had kept a personal archive of significant stories, including the 1912 deaths. He shared with Catherine not just his notes on the case, but a photograph that had never been published, an image of one of the victims showing what appeared to be a small, circular mark on the throat, similar to the imprint that might be left by a tube or pipe. More significantly, Pierce revealed that following the discovery of the bodies, he had received a strange letter. Written in an elegant, precise hand, the letter contained only a brief message. The vessel must be prepared with care, for what it shall contain is more precious than the blood of kings. Enclosed with the letter was a small disc of beeswax, smooth on one side and bearing the impression of what appeared to be a human lip on the other. Catherine's next destination was Cincinnati, where she hoped to learn more about the case of Edward Green, the physician suspected of being Whitaker under an assumed identity. The official records were sparse, but through persistent research, she located a former nurse who had worked at the hospital during Green's time there. The nurse, Harriet Summers, now in her 70s, provided a troubling account. Dr. Green, if that was really his name, had a way about him that made the other staff keep their distance. Always polite, always professional, but there was something in his eyes, like he was looking through you, not at you. He took a particular interest in terminal cases, often volunteering to sit with patients in their final hours. After he was arrested, several of the nursing staff came forward with stories of finding him alone with recently deceased patients, claiming to be preparing the body. One nurse swore she saw him holding something over a patient's mouth as they took their last breath, a small jar or vial, but her account was dismissed as hysterical imagination. Most disturbing was Summers' recollection of a conversation she had overheard between Green and a hospital administrator just days before his arrest. Green had been advocating for a research project involving what he called the preservation of vital essence through respiratory capture. When questioned about the potential benefits of such research, he had reportedly smiled and said, "Imagine never having to fear the passage of time. Imagine drawing upon the collected vitality of hundreds, perhaps thousands, to extend one's own journey indefinitely. What price would you place on such a possibility?" As Catherine continued her investigation, a pattern began to emerge, not just of similar crimes spanning decades, but of a philosophy being passed from one individual to another, evolving and adapting while maintaining its core belief in the power of the terminal breath. Whether these were all the work of Whitaker himself, somehow extending his life beyond normal human limitations, or the result of disciples carrying on his work, remained unclear. In August 1933, Catherine's research took an unexpected turn when she received a letter from Dr. James Thornton, a professor of anthropology at Princeton University. Thornton had read one of Catherine's preliminary articles about the Whitaker case in an academic journal and recognized elements that connected to his own research into certain obscure religious practices. In their subsequent meeting, Thornton shared his insights. "What you're describing bears remarkable similarities to practices found in certain isolated communities in the Carpathian Mountains and parts of rural Russia. These traditions, which date back centuries, involve the belief that the final breath of a dying person contains their vital essence or soul. In some variants, breath stealers were thought to capture this essence in specially prepared vessels, often made of natural materials like beeswax, and consume it to extend their own lives. Most scholars dismiss these as mere folklore, but my research suggests there may have been actual practitioners of such rituals, individuals who formed a loose network across Eastern Europe and possibly migrated to the United States in the late 19th century. If your Elias Whitaker encountered such individuals during his time at Johns Hopkins, it could explain the origin of his fixation." Thornton provided Catherine with translations of several obscure texts that described these practices in detail, including the preparation of beeswax vessels, the construction of apparatus for breath capture, and rituals for the consumption of the collected essence. The similarities to the methods described in Whitaker's ledgers were undeniable. Armed with this new context, Catherine revisited the timeline of Whitaker's life, focusing on his time at Johns Hopkins. University records indicated that during his final year of medical study, he had worked closely with a visiting scholar from Austria, Dr. Anton Liebrecht, whose area of research was listed as comparative respiratory physiology. Further investigation revealed that Liebrecht had left Johns Hopkins abruptly around the same time as Whitaker's expulsion, returning to Europe and eventually taking a position at a small private research institute in the Austrian Alps. The institute, funded by an anonymous benefactor, had been the subject of local controversy. due to rumors about the nature of the research conducted there before being destroyed in a fire in 1895. Liebrecht himself had reportedly perished in the blaze, along with several colleagues and test subjects. Or had he? Catherine discovered a passenger manifest from a ship that had arrived in New York in February 1896, listing among its passengers one A. Liebrecht, occupation given as natural philosopher. The manifest indicated that Liebrecht had been traveling from Vienna and was bound for West Virginia, the very state where Elias Whitaker would establish his beekeeping operation later that same year. The connection was tantalizing, but far from conclusive. If Liebrecht had survived and come to America, had he reconnected with his former student? Had they continued their research together? Or had Whitaker perhaps assumed Liebrecht's identity after the fire, using it to escape whatever scrutiny might have followed him from Johns Hopkins? Catherine's investigation took her next to the small West Virginia town that had once been Blackwell Hollow. Though the community no longer existed as such, the land where Whitaker's cabin had stood was now owned by a reclusive widow named Eleanor Whitfield. After several attempts to arrange a meeting, Catherine finally received an invitation to visit Mrs. Whitfield at her home, a modest farmhouse approximately a mile from Whitaker's former property. Catherine's notes from September 12, 1933, describe the encounter. Mrs. Whitfield is an elegant woman in her 60s, with silver hair and remarkably steady hands. Her home is immaculate, filled with antique furniture and the sweet scent of beeswax candles. She explained that she purchased the property, including Whitaker's former land, in 1920 from a bank that had acquired it due to unpaid taxes. She claims to know little about Whitaker himself, though she admitted to having heard stories about the former owner. When I mentioned the ledgers, she became noticeably tense, her fingers worrying at a small pendant she wears around her neck, a disc of amber or perhaps beeswax, enclosed in a silver setting. Most interesting was her reaction when I asked about the cellar, where Whitaker had conducted his experiments. "That place is sealed," she said, with such vehemence that I was momentarily taken aback. Some places should remain undisturbed. When I pressed further, suggesting that examining the site might help bring closure to the families of Whitaker's victims, she fixed me with a stare that seemed to look through rather than at me, reminiscent of what Nurse Summers had said about Dr. Green. "The dead have found their peace," she said. "It would be cruel to disturb them now." Despite Mrs. Whitfield's reluctance, Catherine was determined to examine the site of Whitaker's cabin. She returned the following day with a local guide who knew the area well, only to discover that sometime during the night a fire had swept through the forest, concentrating particularly on the area where the cabin had stood. The ground was still smoldering when they arrived, making any examination impossible. The local sheriff deemed the fire accidental, likely caused by a lightning strike during a brief overnight storm. Catherine, however, noted in her journal that the skies had been clear when she retired for the evening at her boarding house in the nearby town, and no one she spoke with recalled any storm. As September turned to October, Catherine's investigation increasingly focused on the possibility that Whitaker's methods had been passed to others, creating a lineage of practitioners who continued his work in secret. She compiled a list of individuals who might have had contact with Whitaker or Green, or who had demonstrated similar interests and methodology. Dr. Samuel Graves, a physician at Bellevue Hospital in New York, who had been dismissed in 1911 after being discovered conducting unauthorized experiments on deceased patients. Graves had disappeared before he could be questioned by authorities. Professor Martin Holcomb of the University of Chicago, whose 1922 monograph on the preservation of vital essence had been withdrawn from publication after concerns were raised about his research methods. Holcomb had taken a leave of absence shortly thereafter and never returned to his position. Dr. Elizabeth Crane, a respiratory specialist who had worked at several tuberculosis sanatoriums across the eastern United States between 1915 and 1928. Crane had been noted for her interest in the terminal respiratory patterns of her patients and had kept detailed records of their final moments. She had relocated to Europe in 1929, ostensibly to study at the University of Vienna, but no record of her enrollment could be found. The connection between these individuals and Whitaker remained circumstantial at best. However, Catherine discovered that all three had been present at a medical conference in Baltimore in 1910, where one of the presenters had been Dr. William Osler, the same professor who had known Whitaker during his time at Johns Hopkins. The title of Osler's presentation, Ethical Considerations in Respiratory Research. As her investigation continued, Catherine began to experience increasingly disturbing phenomena. She would wake in the night to the scent of honey and beeswax, though no source could be found. Her notes would sometimes contain passages she had no memory of writing, in a handwriting similar to but distinct from her own. Most unsettling were the dreams, vivid, detailed visions of a man she somehow knew to be Whitaker, though she had never seen his photograph, showing her how to prepare beeswax ledgers and explaining in a soft, patient voice the proper technique for capturing the essence. In her journal entry for October 7th, 1933, Catherine wrote, "I fear that my immersion in this case is affecting my mental state. Last night's dream was the most vivid yet. I was in a room I did not recognize, seated at a table covered with sheets of beeswax. Whitaker, or the man I believed to be Whitaker, stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders. The vessel must be prepared with care," he said, and I realized he was speaking of me. I was to be the vessel, not for someone else's essence, but for his knowledge, his techniques, his philosophy. I woke, gasping for breath, as if something had been covering my mouth and nose. The scent of honey was overwhelming. On my bedside table was an object I cannot account for, a small disc of what appears to be beeswax, smooth on one side and bearing the impression of lips on the other. I have sealed it in an envelope and will take it to Professor Thornton at Princeton tomorrow. I must know if I am being followed or if my mind is creating these experiences from the material I have been researching. Catherine's meeting with Professor Thornton on October 8th would prove to be a turning point in her investigation. Thornton examined the beeswax disc and confirmed that it was genuine, not a product of Catherine's imagination. More significantly, he recognized the lip impression as matching the description of seals used by practitioners of the Carpathian breath-stealing cult he had researched. Thornton's concern for Catherine's safety was evident. He urged her to discontinue her investigation, warning that she might have attracted the attention of individuals who would go to great lengths to protect their secrets. When Catherine refused, citing her journalistic duty to uncover the truth, Thornton reluctantly shared one final piece of information, a name he had encountered in his research that might provide answers: Irina Vassiliev. According to Thornton, Vassiliev had been a member of a Russian noble family with rumored connections to the breath-stealing cult. She had emigrated to the United States in 1878, settling in Baltimore, where she established herself as a patron of medical research at Johns Hopkins. Her particular interest? Respiratory physiology and the mechanics of death. The connection was clear. Vassiliev had been at Johns Hopkins during the period when both Whitaker and Liebrecht were there. Could she have been the link that introduced them to the ancient practice of breath-stealing? Or was her role even more significant? Catherine's next step was to locate any surviving records related to Irina Vassiliev. Her search led her to the archives of the Baltimore Historical Society, where she discovered that Vassiliev had died, or at least been declared dead, in 1900, the same year as Catherine Whitaker's supposed death from tuberculosis. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. Catherine began to formulate a new theory. What if Irina Vassiliev and Catherine Whitaker were the same person? What if Whitaker's wife had not been a victim but a collaborator, faking her death to pursue their research unencumbered by public scrutiny? To test this theory, Catherine sought out church records from Blackwell Hollow, hoping to find details of Catherine Whitaker's burial. What she discovered instead was that there had been no burial. Elias Whitaker had claimed his wife's body had been cremated at her request, an unusual practice for the time and place. Further investigation revealed that Irina Vasilyev had withdrawn a substantial sum from her Baltimore bank account just days before her reported death, enough to finance years of research or a new identity. The bank records included a signature that Catherine had photostated and later compared to the few surviving examples of Catherine Whitaker's handwriting from church donation records. The similarities were striking. As Catherine pieced together this new narrative, she began to see the Whitaker case in a different light. Perhaps Elias had not been working alone, but in partnership with his wife, a woman who might have brought the ancient knowledge of breath-stealing from her European origins. Together, they could have continued their work for decades, assuming new identities as needed, creating a network of like-minded practitioners across the country. This theory gained further support when Catherine discovered a photograph in the archives of the Berkeley County Register, taken at a charity event in 1927. In the background, partially obscured but still recognizable from earlier photographs, was a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the description of Eleanor Whitfield, the current owner of Whitaker's former property.